Welcome. This is a joint event with Bristol Indie Media and Bristol Radical History, and it's 25 years since the miners' strike, and we felt this is a really important event in British social history with consequences still for today. So we put together two events. This is the first, the second is on the 15th. We hope we can make both. I won't talk too much to it, but the format for tonight is going to be, we've got about 20 minutes of films to set the scene, because I know a couple of us, well, myself included, were very young when it all happened, so a reminder of the history, and that then leaves the speakers we've got to really focus on their own experiences and expertise in the area. And each of the speakers is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll do a more general questions and answers type thing. But we're really, really pleased and really privileged to have three excellent speakers. We've got Nick Jones, who's the one of the authors of the book down here, Shafted, which is produced by the Campaign for Press Freedom. He was a BBC radio correspondent at the time of the strike, so actually involved in the coverage. So it's going to be really amazing to hear his experience of what happened there and the reflections on that. We've got Dave Douglas, who was in the National Union of Mine Workers, still is in the National Union of Mine Workers, and he's going to be sharing his experiences as, I believe, a picket coordinator. And then also we've got Glenn Burrows, who was in the time involved in the miners' support groups, and she's going to be talking to us about the experience of that and the reflections on that. I just want to say a big thank you to Bridgewater and Somerset Association of Trade Union Councils, and also to the National Union of Journalists, all of whom have given some financial support to enable us to get all the speakers and everybody here. I also want to point out that both the book Shafted and also Dave Douglas's two books are there, and they'll be able to get signed at the end of the event. And I thoroughly recommend you support the event by taking in even more information there. And we will also be filming this. We've got an archive of past talks, which you can get links to off bristol.indiemedia.org, and this will be joining a lot of the other popular past talks we've got, which include Mozambique talking about his experience in Guantanamo Bay, the last film night we had talking about the war resistors during the Vietnam War, and there's also a really interesting one about the death of Dr. David Kelly. And this will be going up on there, and if you watch the site, that will be popping up, or our Twitter feed, that will be popping up on there.
Well, we certainly saw there the images of the strike as seen through some of the news media, and I think what's so important about an event like this, the untold story of the miners' strike, is that students of contemporary history know only too well that there can often be a mismatch between events as they were reported and those same events as they were witnessed by those who experienced them. And equally, though, historians know the value of examining the way that events were reported at the time by the journalists of the day, because often with hindsight and with the passage of years, hidden agendas can be seen with an even greater clarity than before. Therefore, I think tonight's event has a relevance for me, because I was one of the journalists who spent a year of my life reporting that strike, and it's timely on the 25th anniversary, and right and proper that people like me should be held to account, if you like, and have to answer for what we said at the time. Now, it might seem far-fetched to suggest that one day there might be a military-style reenactment of key moments of the strike. But the final day of the Battle of Orgreave, we saw mentions of it, but the final day of the Battle of Orgreave, that was the day when 10,000 pickets were confronted by 4,000 police officers. That would have been one of the days that would certainly have been worthy of reenactment. Now, not surprisingly, and we just saw it coming through in the film there, the reporting of by the BBC attracted considerable contention, caused considerable contention. And the BBC is in the dock, especially over Orgreave, because the pictures on its main television report presented the battle in the reverse order. The pickets were shown attacking the police, when those on the ground at Orgreave said that in fact that it was the miners who were retaliating after they had been subjected first to baton-wielding police officers. And in one of the chapters in Shafted, the book that I've contributed to, you will see there that there's an account from a Yorkshire Evening Post reporter, Peter Lazenby, and he says that the BBC did reverse the shots. And in reviewing this book for the big journalism quarterly magazine, the British Journalism Review, its founding editor has gone even further. He says that he now has impeccable evidence that there were specific instructions to the BBC from the highest level of the government to ensure that the television cameras filming the events concentrated on the miners' violence and not on the police bashing in heads. And of course we saw that reflected on that YouTube film. So Goodman, Geoffrey Goodman, the person who wrote this review, he's categorical. He says there was state interference in the BBC's coverage. Now, as somebody who was employed by the BBC at the time, I would dispute that, and I'll come directly more to it in a moment. Now, I wasn't at Orgreave that day, and I wasn't there during the violence of the preceding days, and at the time, my job was working for BBC Radio. I was a labour and industrial correspondent, and it was my job to keep pace with the wider industrial repercussions of the dispute and the ins and outs of the negotiations. And I can't offer, therefore, an eyewitness account of what happened, but I can give an insider's view of events as they were perceived within the BBC, and that's what I'll come to. But to begin with, what I think is perhaps more important is that I should perhaps examine those areas where I might personally be at fault. Now, the military analogy, which I opened with, I think is pertinent, because the miners' strike was seen, at least through the eyes of much of the news media, and you certainly saw that reflected in those films just now, as a fight to the finish between Arthur Scargill and Margaret Thatcher. The forces of the state were mobilised against the shock troops of organised labour. Now, reporters rarely indulge in public soul searching. We're very, I think, under attack for not having a crisis of conscience. I will have to say, though, looking back on my 50 years as a journalist, that it was certainly the most momentous year of my life. And I freely admit that covering the miners' strike was the story which troubled me most of all, and still troubles me most of all, when I look back and remember the way the miners' struggle was reported. And the subsequent, and this is so important, the subsequent minimal editorial scrutiny of the subsequent ruination of that industry by the Conservatives. Now, in view of the vindictive pit closure programme, you didn't get a sense of that from the film, which continued during the decade which followed the strike. I think that perhaps the media should own up to a collective failure of judgment, because our failure of judgment is comparable, in my opinion, to the sort of failure of judgment that occurred in the build-up to the Iraq War. Now, most journalists have accepted, at least some of those that I know have, that not enough was done to question the pre-war intelligence about the chemical and biological weapons that Iraq was supposed to hold in the run-up to the Iraq War. Now, likewise, could the same charge be levelled against the correspondents of the day in the early 80s? Now, my former colleagues might not all agree with me, but when I think back to the early 80s, I don't think that any of us really imagined that the Conservatives' contempt for the coal industry and the Thatcherite fear would be so great, and their hatred was so great of the National Union of Mine Workers, that a Conservative government would in the end all but destroy the British coal industry and marginalise such an important energy source. Now, I say this, and perhaps you doubt it, but for my own part, I have to admit that at the time, I still took it for granted that a Conservative government still believed that coal had a future, and that once the uneconomic pits that were the cause of the strike were shut, that there would be a future for the coal industry. Now, I didn't suspect at the time that even the direst predictions of the NUM would be met in full. Because we have to remember, and it's important to look at the history of this, that it wasn't until 1992, under John Major, that Michael Heseltine finally broke the back of the British coal industry when he ordered the closure of 31 of the remaining 50 pits and the loss of another 30,000 jobs. And viable pits were closed because of the Conservatives' dash for gas. Short-term economics ruled the day. Gas-fired power stations burning North Sea gas were cheaper to build than new, more expensive coal-fired stations. And that's, of course, why we've got an energy crisis today. So any thoughts that journalists like myself might have had back in '84, that there was some good faith towards the coal industry, they were all tragically misplaced. Misplaced by what we saw a decade later. And I have to say that I haven't seen much sign, as I say, of a crisis of conscience among correspondents over this, but that's certainly what has struck me, that we perhaps were misled, and we perhaps misled others about the true intentions, just as journalists misled the public about the intentions of Tony Blair and George Bush when it came to the Iraq War. Now, I would contend that a broadcaster like myself, working on radio, we did try valiantly to report both sides of the strike. And of course, we were doing so against a narrative which comes out very clearly in those films, that the country couldn't afford to continue subsidizing uneconomic pits. The devastating though this might be for the communities, the strike was a denial of democracy. That the picket lines constituted a threat to democratic government of the country. That was the narrative that was being, I think, propagated by the media of the day. And that underlying storyline is something, as I say, that now comes to trouble me. Because part of the problem was, you see, is that Arthur Scargill, as the union's president, believed that the union could win through their industrial strength. And in his opinion, the NUM didn't seek or need, at the time, and this is important historically, a favourable platform in the media. Journalists from the national press, radio and television, we weren't welcome in a lot of the mining communities. Now, you could say that that was because of allegations that our coverage was biased, but the reality was, you see, as Scargill told me personally during the strike, that his hostility to the media was a calculated act. It was designed to stiffen the resolve of miners and their families. And in his opinion, journalists like myself, we were part and parcel of the class enemy. We were, as he never tired of reminding people like me, a bunch of piranha fish who would always go on supporting Thatcher and the coal board, even when the Conservatives had been exposed as being guilty of duplicity. Now, as the strike wore on, and this is what is so important historically to get across, as the strike went on and it became clear that this dispute couldn't be won through industrial muscle alone, there was no doubt about it that the NUM found itself increasingly at a disadvantage. Because once it became clear by the summer of '84 that there wasn't a realistic chance of a negotiated settlement, and that was certainly the view of the government and many, many of the commentators in the media, the balance of the coverage tipped, and this again worries me as I look back, tipped almost completely in favour of the coal board and of Margaret Thatcher. Most radio and television journalists in effect became what I've called cheerleaders for the return to work, because by then the narrative of the story, as it was presented through the media, had progressed to a much simpler storyline. This was that the outcome would depend on the coal board's success in persuading the miners to abandon the strike and rejoin their pits. We saw a flavour of that in our film. Now, the media's attention was focused on what were called the new faces, those going back to work for the first time. And for the newspapers, these men were the heroes. And the television pictures filmed mainly from behind the police lines, you got a flavour of that in those television reports, they showed the men breaking the strike, returning to work, braving the pickets. And effectively, the news media had turned into a propaganda a machine, if you like, on behalf of the government. And of course the point was that once the coal board could claim that half the men were back at work, Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, would be able to declare a victory, and that, of course, is what she eventually did. Now, as defeat loomed for the NUM, I felt easy. I realised how we were being manipulated by the focus on new faces, and I tried to blow the whistle on it. For example, in January '85, I amassed a lot of evidence that the Coal Board had been quietly massaging down the number of men on the books so that it would be possible to hasten the day when Mrs. Thatcher could declare victory. I had a report broadcast on the Today programme. A week later, I was instructed to report to the Secretary of the BBC's governors. I was told that my revelations were not regarded as having been helpful. You note the word, helpful. We wonder in what cause. Now, I had no difficulty at the time in proving conclusively that my figures were accurate, and I heard no more. Now, that was my only, and I have to explain this historically, that was my only experience of potential interference in my reporting. And I can honestly say I was never told what to say, and I wasn't put under any pressure. And this gets back to my final point, the Battle of Orgreave, and to this complaint of Geoffrey Goodman, that the BBC's camera crews were actually instructed to focus their filming on the miners' violence. Now, I have to say, I don't believe that there was such an instruction. You might say that it wasn't necessary even to issue an instruction because the BBC was doing what the government wanted. I accept that that is an argument. Now, I frequently come under pressure, though, and this is what I wanted historically just to put into context. I frequently, subsequently, come under pressure when working in an edit suite. And it is very easy when you're compiling a filmed report to paste in the pictures in the wrong order. And what I think comes through to me from my recollections of this event is that undoubtedly mistakes were made. They would be impossible to make now because, of course, all film is time-coded and it wouldn't be possible to make a mistake in that way. Finally, what could we say is the lesson that has been learnt from the terrible, terrible days of the miners' strike? Well, one is, of course, that no union would ever again fight a dispute and allow sections of the media to become alienated. We only have to think of the firefighters' disputes. Whenever now, for example, the FBU holds a dispute, what do? They light a brazier at the fire station. They peacefully picket with some placards. They allow the journalists to film their reports to camera from the fire station. They are letting the pictures tell the story. And that, I think, if I look back on the 84-5 strike, was the fact that there was no doubt about it, that many of the journalists were not welcome, the media was distrusted, and that inevitably, I think, hastened the end of the miners' struggle in the sense that it put the NUM at a terrible handicap because they couldn't use the media as the platform that they needed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I invite Glenn? Are you okay?
Yes, I think next.
That order?
Tom, am I going to mess up the filming if I sort of sit down here? Because I'm being blinded.
No,
by the
please
light.
don't be blinded.
And
Yeah,
then,
come
then
down.
you can look down on me instead of me looking down on you. If you see what I mean.
You just move the mic.
Sorry about that. I'm trying to see everything else one time. Sorry, that's much better. You may not want to see me, but I'd like to see you. Thanks. My name is Glenn Burrows. I'm currently Secretary of the Rail Workers Branch in Bristol, the RMT. In 1984, I was the constituency Labour Party Secretary in Bridgewater constituency. In between those two titles is a wealth of experience and hard-learned lessons, I can assure you. I'm extremely proud to have played a very small supporting role in what, to me, must inevitably be described as the most important class struggle of post-war Britain. And I reckon, and I really don't want to offend anyone, but whoever put that caption, and I can't remember the words, but it says something like, "The struggle was a complete waste," should be shot. Because, you know, Scargill, I think, was completely correct, not in every way, but in certainly saying that the struggle was absolutely vital. Because what those clips didn't make clear, I think, and I think needs to be understood about the miners' strike is that it was almost won. The miners' strike, the attack on the miners, the attack on the National Union of Mine Workers was planned well in advance of 1984 by the government. It wasn't a kind of sudden, unrehearsed response to naughty trade unionists deciding to defend their pits and their communities. I think it was Nigel Lawson, wasn't it, who, probably somebody else, but they're all the same to me, Tories. I think Nigel Lawson said it was like preparing for the war against Nazi Germany. So there was no accident about the miners' strike. There was no sort of, my God, and you know, I have to say, the previous speaker, I totally disagree with you. I don't think the miners' strike was won or lost by the role of the media, although, you know, I have every respect. But I have total respect for the media, and I think they learned a lot of lessons like we all did. The miners' strike was planned by the government. It was almost won. I think none of us quite, you know, fully appreciated until after the miners' strike how, you know, it was not a complete and out-and-out inevitable disaster. What lost the miners' strike, in my view, is the inability of the so-called Labour movement and its leaders, the TUC, the Labour Party, and those hapless people, we can see them all before us now, those hapless expense-claiming hordes that we have wrongfully, I think, over the years neglected to lead our wonderful movement. Because there's no doubt about it to me, the miners' strike, you know, the miners, their courage, the courage of their families, their political courage, and their cause was absolutely correct. And had they had the support, I mean, you think about this, the miners' strike was announced in March 1984. The TUC, that great ship of leadership of the Labour movement, didn't meet to discuss the miners' strike until August of that year. That's how important it was to the TUC. And, you know, those kind of facts really do have to be borne in mind. And I really get angry when people go around talking about things like, well, you know, if only Arthur Scarfield had a ballot, and, you know, if only the miners hadn't, you know, alienated the media, and if only they hadn't been so violent on the picket lines. My God, I even remember a Hyde Park rally when Tommy Sheridan, then of the Militant Tendency, talked about naming names. I mean, that was how completely sold so many sections of our community were, you know, on not supporting this important struggle as fully as they should have done. So, I mean, that's not what I'm here to talk about, because I've got to go on to talk about support groups. But I really just wanted to start off saying that, you know, please don't let us believe that defeat was inevitable. It was not. We almost won. Now, 1984 miners' strike was important for me because it changed my life, as simply as that. And I know it changed the lives of a lot of other people. It helped me to understand. I mean, there I was, bumbling along, constituency Labour Party secretary, you know, doing my best, not entirely kind of convinced that the Labour Party was the right place to be, and I was in the left on the Labour Party. What happened during that year completely changed my perspective on trade unions, on the Labour Party, on the TUC, and of course on the police. The police were shocking during that year. I think, you know, many people, you know, if they were around then will remember how brutal some of the battles were. The scenes, which weren't shown in there, but the scenes in the Battle of Orgreave of young miners fleeing, you know, bare-chested, bloody, being chased by riot police were not the sort of thing that people expected to see. It really happened. It's hard to imagine it now. It may not be harder in a few years' time, because I think the current government is preparing well to perhaps put us in that kind of situation again. But to me, that class struggle of 1984 to 1985, the miners fighting to defend communities, the brutality of the government, the brutality of the police, you know, set me on a course that really I don't think I've changed from ever since. The other important thing for me of that year is it showed the potential of working class people united in struggle. You know, we could have won. The experience of support groups, of working in support groups to defend the miners, the achievements of the support groups were, I think, worthy of historical record. Very, very important, and I'm glad that I was part of that. Because 1984 to 1985 strike demonstrated both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Labour movement. There's no doubt about it to me. And what we have to do today, because I think we are we're nearing, perhaps we're coming to a time in our history when we may be facing some of these same upheavals, and we have to learn from both the strengths and the weaknesses. When the miners' support groups, the support groups are very important. I was one of the co-founders of the Bridgewater support group. We had a large number of support groups in Somerset, and they were, of course, throughout the country. The support groups were started by the miners, and they were developed by the miners' wives and families who were mentioned on some of those clips. And the support groups spread to all areas, including, of course, non-mining areas like Somerset, although Somerset has got links with the mining industry, as you'll see on the banner, which I'll explain in a minute. I think it's kind of, again, really important to establish the achievement of those. I mean, something like £60 million was raised during that year for the miners. Not all of it by support groups, obviously, but by trade unions, by supporters of the miners, £60 million. And, you know, those support groups set up an alternative welfare network. No doubt about it. People actually didn't realise during that year how much suffering there was in the mining communities. It was actually after the strike that, you know, the miners kind of had to start paying their debts, and you know, they had no jobs to go to, that their real hardship was revealed. But during that year, starting with the wives and families of the miners, the support group principle was extremely important in helping to prolong that strike. I mean, it kept miners fed and their children fed and their families fed, and it was an extremely successful venture. And I think that it's important to recognise that kind of alternative welfare network, and I think it's something we ought to think about. You know, maybe we're going to need again in the future. It's not easy to get money out of trade union funds to support strikers always, but you know, I'd always had this dream that after the miners' strike, that for instance trades councils, those of you who are familiar with trades councils, might set up something kind of similar, so that we'd always have a fund easily available to support strikers. And I think it's worth thinking about that. I think that was a great achievement of the support groups. The other great achievement, of course, in the mining communities for women was the way it brought women into the forefront of the miners' strike. Now, you know, in a lot of strikes in the past, women have kind of been used almost as strike breakers. You know, these kind of images you used to get of sort of, oh, you know, the women and children begging the men to go back to work, you know, and that completely changed. Not only that, you know, I think, and I don't know if anyone's ever written about this, but it also changed a lot of the culture of the mining communities. I was talking to the wife, or the ex-wife actually, of a former Yorkshire miner last week, and she'd been active in one of the women's support groups, and she said that up until 1984, I mean, there were all these things on during the strike, you know, these awfully non-politically correct remarks that miners used to make about women, the sort of get your tits out thing, you know, when the miners had been marching. I mean, I'm sure some of you have heard those, and they were well rehearsed in the media. And you know, young miners were kind of not renowned for being politically correct about women. And Pam told me that, of course, in 1984 was the first year. Up till then, the NUM had always had a beauty pageant. And 1984 was the first year, apparently, when that beauty pageant didn't happen. And I tell you why, it didn't happen because the women's support groups were insisting it didn't. It was the men. It was the men who said, we don't want all this shit anymore. You know, we've got women here fighting on the picket lines. We've got women supporting, keeping our strike going. We don't want anything to do with that. And I mean, I think that was, again, the role of the women's support groups, because the women, you know, the women in the mining communities weren't just staying in the mining communities and feeding kids. They were out. They were international. They were moving about. They were making links with activists all over the country, and they were becoming politicised. And I remember that in the support group, I mean, one of my functions in the support group was that I lived halfway between Hinkley Point, the nuclear power station, that I'm sure you've all heard of, and my house was a halfway house for the pickets of Hinkley Point. And I do remember the very first night that the first pickets arrived, because half of them would go and picket and the other half would, you know, stay in my house and have baths and get sort of have some sleep and everything. And I remember one young Welsh miner saying to me, you know, in sort of the early weeks of the strike really, excuse my Welsh accent, it's crap, but never will I stand with a woman on a picket line, you know. And I was saying, well, do you not think maybe you're going to have to change that attitude a little bit when, you know, as the strike goes on? And of course, you know, that was so, to me, such a lesson in how the culture of so many of those mining communities changed. And I firmly believe that the reason that happened was the women's support groups. So I was, I helped to set up a Bridgewater miners support group, and there were many other support groups in Somerset, and we set up, this is a historical tale as well. At the time we had a full-time Transport and General Workers Union, Unite office in Bridgewater, full-time officer, and we actually used that union office as the sort of headquarters of the miners support group. A few years later Bill Morris closed it down, so they were never going to allow that kind of thing to happen again. But I mean, it's significant to me that in 1984 we had at our disposal the resources of a full-time local office, and that was, I'm sure that was happening in many other towns as well. We had, you know, obviously collections outside supermarkets. We had, I think, a very, very good response. I think it's also very important to note, I'm so sorry. Leaflets, demonstrations, supporting the pickets, carrying out levies on workplaces. You know, there are people giving a regular amount from their wages every week for a year for the miners' strike. The supporters groups were, I think, absolutely crucial to helping keep morale up and keep helping the strike going. Out of that, for us in Somerset, came the banner that you can see there, because at the end of the strike we said, you know, the miners' strike started out of a desire to defend communities, not just to please the union leadership. It was rank and file miners knowing that, you know, their communities were going to be destroyed. And so that banner was the outcome for us in Somerset of all the Somerset miner support groups wanting to keep going. And throughout the 90s, in fact, and up to the anti-poll tax union days, we kept that campaigning going. Why we're not still doing that is another story, but, you know, I've got to finish now. I think I just want to finish by saying the biggest lesson that I learned is that through the miners' support groups is autonomy. We can do it ourselves. I really firmly believe that still. I've never changed it. I think we can do it without TUCs, without political parties, certainly without some of the left-wing groups that played some very funny games in the miners' strike. I think the rank and file support for rank and file miners was a very, very crucial political lesson. I think we need to keep understanding it and to keep learning it, and I think we're going to need to do it again very soon. Sorry to go on so long.
I agree with the final comments, and I would refer any of the, let's say, the libertarian syndicalist papers to future historians like the Black Flag, Direct Action and others to see the way in which they covered the strike as opposed to more conventional Marxist-Leninist papers, whereas one facilitates what the workers are saying, the other one is telling us by and large what to do. It's so easy to be sidetracked by this, and I haven't prepared notes because it is only 10 minutes. I don't think it's possible to actually understand this clash without understanding the nature of the miners, and I cannot really give that in great depth except to say that for at least back until the beginning of the 1700s, don't worry, I'm not going to do a chronology from there, but at least from the 1700s, the miners have been the force most likely to, in terms of being revolutionary potential. There were no other sources of power. Wherever there was coal in the ground, wherever capitalism was developing, they needed miners and they needed coal. So we had, to some extent, got a huge bargaining power, which they were always very aware of, and we became increasingly aware of. So by the time you get to the Chartists, for example, like a half of the Chartists executive is made up of the executive of the miners' union. So the two things are cheek by jowl the same, and whether it's the conditions of working in the mine, solidarity, the isolation, the miners weren't a job you dipped in and out of. It wasn't something like you went to work on the docks for half a day and then worked in the field for 3 days afterward or whatever. When you were in mining, you were in mining. Partly that was because the owners had a bond that bonded the mine in Scotland for life. All miners' children had to work in the mine. It was, you could be imprisoned for employing a miner's child when it was the property of the coal owner. For 45, 50 years after the abolition, formal abolition of slavery in America, we still had slavery here in terms of the bonded labour of miners. In the northeastern coalfield, which was a huge coalfield, Northumberland and Durham, we had a little bit more libertarian bosses there, because they only bonded us for a year when you had to work for them, and again you could be jailed or whatever for employing a runaway miner from there. So it wasn't always to do with that we actually wanted to be there. It was that they wouldn't let us go anywhere else, really. But miners became a very father to son industry. Father to son in the northeast, that was, of course. Women worked in the mines in Scotland and Yorkshire and Lancashire until the 1860s, underground that was, and they continued on the surface until the 1960s, particularly in Lancashire. Well, by and large, it's been a mill industry, and you went there and you've always worked there. Yeah. I mean, when we talked about the struggle of our forefathers, academics thought we were speaking sort of figuratively, and we weren't. We were talking literally. I mean, my dad and my granddad and my great-granddad all worked in the industry, and that's totally common. So, you know, I always say that when you were a kid in a pit community, you didn't so much get Goldilocks and the Three Bears as Churchill in 1926 strike, and you know, so there was no denying that there was a highly politicised community there. We knew who the class enemy was, and they knew who we were. Mainly because we had something that they desperately wanted. And we were very good at keeping other people out, which could relate to another debate that you can have at another time about workers trying to shorten the pool of labour to heighten their bargaining power, which is the way we've always done that. No disrespect to anybody else, but that's the way we've always done that. And the miners' union, of course, became very powerful. Nobody would work in the miners who were in the miners' union. Nobody would go down the pit with you if you weren't in the miners' union. So the union was always powerful there. Now, we were defeated loads and loads of times, but whenever they needed power, they needed us. So we always knew that even when the union was broken from time to time, that they'd have to come back, and there was always a vision that we could come back. And we could organise, and there was a different kind of a future and a different kind of a world. Now, I spent a large bit of the time not talking about 84, because unless you understand the different perceptions between that community and Thatcher and what Thatcher represented, you will never understand the depth and gravity of that, because it was never about whether a field in far-off Barnsley had a pithead in it or not. It was never about the cost of coal in terms of price. It was never about that. It was about our ability to intervene as a section of the working class to challenge the status quo and change the system. I'm not being romantic when I say that. Every single miners' strike since the year dot has been political in that sense, that it shifted the balance of power from one direction or another. That's why 1926 caused such a revolutionary potential, apart from the fact there was more than 1 million of us then. You know, 1 in every 10 workers was a coal miner in those days. It's always been that way. In 72 and 74, it caused the collapse of first of all, an entire government economic programme in 72, and then brought around the collapse of the government in 1974. Now, these are very disconcerting things for bourgeois politicians and for the ruling class. If you don't have to wait every 5 years for an election to pick and choose between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and you can actually change governments at the point of industrial action, then that's scary. Scary for both sides. It's scary for the Tories, it's scary for Labour. And it's not surprising that after the collapse of the Heath government, both political parties set up think tanks as to ways they could defeat a future miners' strike. The Labour government brought in the incentive scheme, a bonus scheme which divided the miners along regional lines, when previously we'd been united on national lines. Narrow, papered over gaps and chasms which had existed since 1926 opened out again. And the Tories, of course, from 1970s under the Ridley plan, started to prepare this whole programme of private lorry drivers to take coal off the railway, because they knew the railway workers would support the miners, transfer of oil, long-term solution of building nuclear power stations against the coal, because nuclear power stations, by their very nature, don't allow wildcat strikes, otherwise the thing melts down. So yeah, more compliant workforce. There was a way of getting rid of the miners long-term, but in the short term, it was necessary for Thatcher in order to go along with the whole new hard right Tory philosophy which had been worked on for some time, the philosophy of Heysink and the others, the free market economy, the breaking of the labour movement. So you got the lowest common denominator of wages, etc., etc., etc. None of that could happen without you broke the miners' union. So Thatcher wasn't particularly against coal. She had nothing against coal whatsoever. It was the miners she objected to. And I quite believe that at some particular time she thought that it was possible to break the miners' union, to privatise the coal industry, to sell off profitable parts of the coal industry, and still have quite a large coal industry in Britain. It wasn't her vision to decimate the coal industry entirely. It was her vision to debone it and to get the union out of there, to bring in private contracts, to bring in carrots and sticks, and break that whole thing. By 1986, 2 years after the strike, and why this part of the film were wrong is where it said it was worth it, etc. Arthur Scargill always says that we didn't lose the strike, and I always think, thank Christ, because if that was winning it, I'd hate to know what losing it was like. But to some extent he's right. He's right insofar as Thatcher didn't win. Thatcher's plan was to deunionise the industry, privatise the industry, break workers from the union, break that tradition and bring in purely cash incentive orientation at work, as opposed to group identity, self-governing work teams. We selected who was, I mean, to a large extent the miners' union decided who worked at the pit. To a large extent we decided who worked on the face. To a large extent we decided who worked. If the manager didn't present a list of who they wanted for overtime at the weekend, by Thursday they didn't get any, because we wouldn't give them any. So to a large extent we organised underground labour, which is another reason why people say, why the hell did you fight to save those jobs? I mean, my old mate in Durham used to say, you know, fight to save Thatcher's job or Arthur Scargill's job, but for those jobs, why do you want to save those jobs? Well, because it isn't always dirty and horrible. It's also exhilarating and comradely, and it's also the fact that you've got job control. So you haven't got somebody sitting on your back telling you what to do. It's not alienating. You're not pulling the handle all day long, you know, and thinking of somewhere else. It's a more human experience in many ways. Even though that's a contradictory thing from where you're working. So those are the reasons why we wanted to keep that identity and to keep that control. At the end of all of that, when the dust settled and they'd closed, took 100 pits and they got rid of 100,000 miners in 1986, what people forget is we had a national ballot in 1986 for strike action, 2 years after the Great Strike. It returned a 78% yes vote in favour of industrial action. Right? Now, it wasn't acted upon because the NEC should have breaking the piss to vote against the war. But the point was this. British miners still controlled 80% of the national grid. We still had the power. 2/3 of all the miners, probably more, were still in the National Union of Mine Workers, although we had the SCAV outfit still operating by then. So the leopard hadn't changed its spots. It was still there. The NUM was still there. They were still ragging up. They were still going on strike every Friday. They were still not going to work on Monday. They were still the way they always were, even though there was only 2/3 of us left. So Thatcher hadn't won. We actually had not been defeated to the extent that she wanted us to be defeated. In fact, in many ways, as a result of the fight that we made, it got people, although we didn't want the thing, we fought for 12 months to stop it, it gave people more enhanced redundancies than they would ever have seen in their lives. It was letting blokes go out at 55 with 40,000, 45,000 quid, which they could never have ever accumulated. If it hadn't been, ironically, if it hadn't been for the fight we put up, we would never have got any of that. And also because of the position of the union in terms of the miners' pension scheme, it meant people are not so bad off. So we actually got rid of people who wanted to go out, and the average age in the industry went down to something like 35. Now, they had no prospect of going out redundant. There weren't any other jobs anywhere. They weren't going to get a golden handshake because they hadn't worked. So they were more determined to fight than I had been before. And this was starting to make inroads into the UDM. So that's why John Major had to come along with a second tranche of the closure programme in 92 and in 93. And it was actually the attacks in 92 and 93 that broke the back of the miners' union and the coal industry, and now leaves us with a position where we have less than 2,000 miners. We went on strike with 180,000 miners were on strike. 180,000 were on strike. Something just over 200,000 were in the industry. So, you know, we now have less than 2,000 miners in Britain, less than, well, 6 pits ticking over in Britain. However, John Major took 65 million tonnes of coal capacity out of British coal. We now import 70 million tonnes of coal into Britain. So the arguments that it was an anachronism, it was old-fashioned, we wanted to clean energy, etc., 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 is bollocks, basically, because we actually import more coal than we produced, and they closed it. And the irony is that the coal comes on the docks from Immingham, where the strike broke in '85. If it broke anywhere in Britain, it broke at Immingham on the docks by dockers who couldn't hold their water. They were being picketed by fish porters from Peterhead, saying if you break the strike, you're breaking the dock labour scheme, you're breaking the solidarity of the dockers, and they couldn't see it. But in a way there was a quid pro quo because the biggest pile of coal anywhere in Yorkshire is down on the Immingham docks. And that coal comes from third world countries where miners are ruthlessly exploited, where they're blown to kingdom come, where there's no union organisation, where we haven't just exported the exploitation abroad, we've exported the exploitation back through 200 years that we just spent the time struggling out of to come out of. So there's a direct interconnection between the exploitation of miners in China, miners in Colombia, and the defeat of the miners' strike in '84-'85, because the overall condition of the workers in the world went down as a result of the defeat of the British miners. And for the people on the left who continually talk about us being parochial or chauvinistic about fighting for British coal, they really haven't got a clue what we were fighting for, still yet. They didn't understand what we were fighting for then, and they don't understand what we were fighting for now. So, you know, there's a quick ramble through the situation as to where we were and where we are, just to address some, how much time have I got? Just to address some of the myths that have grown up around the strike. Arthur Scargill did not call the strike. The strike started in Yorkshire. He wasn't in Yorkshire. He was a national president. He had nothing whatsoever to do with the start of the strike. The strike started at Cortonwood when the men went on strike and called for support for the rest of the Yorkshire miners. The Yorkshire miners had pitted ballots, pitted votes, and went on strike and picketed the rest of the country, and there it went. Arthur Scargill did not decide not to have a ballot. We had a national conference to decide that. There were 7 resolutions. Arthur didn't speak on any of them. He was in the chair. He didn't vote. He didn't speak. He didn't cast a point of view on whether there should be a ballot or not. So whether or not there was a ballot or not, or whether that was a mistake or not, it wasn't his fault. That was the view of the conference. The conference decided we wouldn't have a ballot. 160,000 miners were on strike. Why did we need a ballot? I came back and asked the men at my pit, as I was instructed to, whether they want a ballot. And 2,000 people in a room like this nearly hung me off a lamppost and said, "You bastards in the executive are trying to sell us down the river because you want us to go away and vote for the strike off because you haven't got the bottle to continue with it." And that's what the rank and file thought. They thought the leadership of the union was trying to sell them out. So that's why they were singing, "Stick your ballot up your arse." They weren't referring to Royal Link, they were referring to us. Stick your ballot up your arse. They didn't want it. And that was a decision of the rank and file. Arthur Scargill didn't organise the picketing. Picketing was organised on an entirely decentralised basis. I was a picket organiser for Doncaster, and I had about 10,000 of the wildest pickets in Britain under my charge, occasionally when they took any notice of me. And Arthur organised the Orgreave action, which I strongly disagree with. Tactically, I thought it was an absolute balls up, but nevertheless, we tried to put some order into that thing. And again, you know, that came down to the change in nature of the trade union movement. Orgreave would have won had workers done what workers did at Saltley in 1972, which was to say, we're not going to watch these miners being battered on the streets and 50,000 Birmingham engineers and car workers down tools and 15,000 of them marched to the gates at Saltley shouting, "Shut the gates." Now, if that had happened in Sheffield, which is just up the road from Orgreave, with all those massive foundries and steelworks plants and all the rest of it, it would have been game shot, would have been over. And just in conclusion, we did come very close to winning 3 occasions. Ian McGregor says so, Margaret Thatcher says so. and that if the dockers' strike had continued, if NACOD had followed through on its ballot result, it got 2 votes, 70-odd% and 86%. So when it said NACOD's scum, worst, scum of the earth, I don't blame the NACOD's members. NACOD's voted twice in 2 national ballots to come on strike. It was the leadership who went away and made a private deal with Thatcher, which left us where we are today. But I will say this, in 92, 93, we'd heard people, trade union leaders all over the country say, we should have supported you in 1984, 85. Well, history rarely repeats itself. And we said to them in 92, 93, here's your opportunity to put right what you didn't do in 84 and 85. We're still waiting for the cavalry to arrive.
Views today, that's if we can learn anything from it, really.
Well, I think the world is different. I think what's happened is that the industrial working class of Europe has been decimated. The industrial working class have been ripped up from the roots and thrown onto the scrap heap. And all of the industries that existed in Europe, in shipbuilding, manufacture, coal mining, steelworks, etc., they're still there, but they're just not in Europe. They've gone abroad. They've gone abroad not because they like the climate, but because they've either got no unions, or because the unions are weaker, or they can smash them down, or in Colombia or in Latin America just shoot trade union leaders dead. And they've gone there because that's a way of exploiting the workers. And of course the working class is different, because the working class has been deindustrialized, it's been depoliticized in the process. If the vast majority of strikes, as you'll see, anybody who studies industrial relations will never tire of showing you the decline in the number of strikes. The decline in the number of strikes is because there's nobody to go on bloody strike. It's not because workers have suddenly thought how good their lot is. It's a bit difficult to go on strike if you're flipping burgers in McDonald's. It was a lot easier if you worked in a foundry, or you worked on a shipyard, or you worked in a pit. And that's where most of the strikes were. And that's why they wanted rid of them. And that's why they've closed us down. And that's why we're basically a service agency. We've actually become, in a sense, the receivers of the wealth produced by people in the third world. Not that we want it, but that's the way we are. We actually don't contribute anything to the productive wealth of the world, in my opinion. So I think things haven't changed. They've just shifted the way they've done it. And I mean, the lessons are really, well, there's too much to answer on somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, the other lesson that we've learned is on the energy front. You see, when Dave talked about the back of the industry being broken in '92, I mean, it was then British Coal. It had moved on from the National Coal Board. And I spent a long time asking the managers there who'd been to see Heseltine and said to him, why are you closing? Why are you closing viable economic pits? And he said, look, the reason we're doing it is because of short-term economics. It's more profitable to open up what we call gas-fired power stations. So our electricity in the last decade, much of it has been generated by burning North Sea gas. That has been used to generate electricity. That's why we've now got an energy gap. And of course, what happened, you see, in the 90s, why the back was broken, that no one was prepared to build new coal-fired power stations. And that's the great debate that's just opened up now as to whether or not Britain can recapture the advances that it had over things like carbon capture. I mean, back in the 80s, there were lots of experiments going on, and they were all lost because of the ruination of the industry. So I think the lesson is that we are now paying the price in 2010, 11, 12 for the energy decisions that were taken back in '92, and they were short-term economic decisions taken by the Conservatives.
Yeah, I think that we need, in the Labour movement, certainly the lesson to be learned is that we need to do our tactics and strategy a lot better. I mean, I was talking with Dave on the way down about, I mentioned the Hinkley Point pickets during the miners' strike. And because I wasn't questioning, I wasn't criticising, I was just, supporting as much as I could. But, thinking about it now, that was a nuclear power station. That picket was a token picket. I didn't think about it very hard at the time. There was no attempt to kind of, really build solidarity. There wasn't even any invitations to the local Labour movement to go on the picket line. I mean, we did. but it was very much a token picket. And it was a bit sort of sloppy when I think about it, because there we were, all these willing people, is that fair to say that? All these willing people out there, could have been a little army that could have been used better. And I don't think it was just Somerset. We tend to be a bit, laid back about this kind of thing. I don't think it was just Somerset. I think it was everywhere. That really, if we had our tactics better sorted out, and we're still doing it. I mean, my union, the RMTs, have 52 strike levels since January. So we're not exactly backward in coming forward on the industrial militancy line. But I tell you what, and Bob Crow in real life is saying this, but we are still bloody sloppy. We don't really think hard in advance about the tactics, the strategy, how we're going to organise our support, how we're going to picket, we just don't really, we aren't very, I hate to use the word professional, it's a word I've always detested, but we're not organised and we're not, military enough about it. And that's, I think, the big lesson to be learned from the miners' strike. Because we could have been then, because we had the resources and the working class responded to the miners. It's not just a romantic myth. All sorts of strange people got involved.
I've got to say, my memory is marching through Llanelli with Canaidra as a pit we were supporting, and I've got to say, my memory of that strike was that real big support from the organised miner support stuff. But Llanelli and like the broader working class, some people did, but there was a big issue as how far the working class supported the miners, and it hurts me to say that. But I just feel, that is a big thing to talk about that strike, because I can remember marching through Llanelli with Canaidra miners, and fucking, people sort of didn't want to know, and that's a bit of memory of those days. And I there's a question mark over what the British, I don't know what Dave Douglas thinks about that, but there is a question mark over that.
On reflection, the lesson is you don't cross picket lines, of course. That's the basic lesson that comes out of it. And in 92, 93, was a big rally. There was 1 million people marched on 2 days. 2 million people on 2 different days in support of the miners. And 12 million work days were lost, mainly through the support of the rail unions and the miners, but people who just couldn't find a way to get to work, and they took solidarity action. But standing in Hyde Park at a big rally, and there were, I'm not being sectarian here, but there were some members of the Socialist Workers' Party who worked in an office somewhere, and they were shouting at the Unison guy, "Call us out!" And we were just thinking, why do you need to be called out? Do you need a special invitation or something to be called? You just go out, You go on strike. You don't need a special invitation from the Lord Mayor or something. And the lesson was on crossing the picket lines. You can blame leaders all you want, but the bloke that drove the truck, the bloke that drove the scab train, the bloke that bloody worked in the coal mine, the bloke that crossed picket lines every day with 20,000 flaming psychopaths with riot sticks to protect him. He knew where his bread was buttered. And the lesson, and nobody forgives them. A scab's a scab is a scab for me. And once you cross the picket line, you burn in hell, as far as I'm concerned.
Dave emphasised how organised the Tories were from 1974 onwards, which was a hugely traumatic moment for them when the government fell. I just got an anecdote about that because it's about Nottinghamshire. Nottinghamshire's always been important because if you can keep coal coming from Nottinghamshire, you keep the Trent power stations open, you keep the national grid going. My dad had been involved in the NUM in Nottinghamshire, had been all sorts of positions in the NUM. He'd retired in 1983. And I remember a discussion with him in late 1983 where he said there's something funny happening in Nottinghamshire. The whole leadership of the branches was changing. All sorts of people who had never been seen or heard of before were suddenly becoming branch secretaries and branch officers because the Tories had sent somebody in there, David Hart, an agent, to organise before the strike, the breaking of the strike in Nottinghamshire, and to organise the UDM to keep the power stations going. Now, they were highly organised, they were highly planned, and my dad's criticism of Yorkshire was that once Scarborough was in power and replaced Gormley, right-wing Gormley, thought that was it, and rank-and-file organisation within other coalfields had been neglected, because in the 70s Nottinghamshire had a CP leadership, but that had been allowed to decline, because we thought, oh well, we run the union now, there's no problem. They were organising, and they were they weren't very successful, but they managed to split the Notts Miners' Union. And just another anecdote before that, because my granddad was also a leader of the Knox miners during the 1926 strike. He was a Labour MP, and he died in the late 1920s. But I've recently got hold of his papers, and he was receiving backhanders from the coal owners to act as their agent during the 26 strike to argue for a return to work. So you talk about corruption of Labour MPs now, nothing's new.
We'll go to the next question if that's right. There's quite a few questions. And then yourself and then yourself.
My name's Dave and I'm from Bristol Trades Council and we've sponsored tonight. And in 1984 I was a Bristol postman, and I remember a mass meeting on pay in Transport House, and we'd suddenly been offered an extra 1.5 or 1.75% because the miners were out, and there were about 100 of us, and the leadership was pretty much solid, loyal Labour leadership. And I remember that I tried in vain with maybe 3 or 4 others out of this 100 to say that the fact that the miners were on strike and that all of a sudden the post office had offered us an extra 1.75% wasn't an argument for accepting that 1.75%, but it was an argument for totally rejecting it and going out on strike for 15%. And that got a resonance that I remember from maybe 15 people at the most kind of clapped out of that 100, and you know, that was it. Now that to me still now raises the question that I haven't quite sorted out in my own mind as to whether it was loyalty to those sort of pro-Labour Party staid middle of the road full-time officials who ran the Bristol Postal Workers branch at the time that was to blame, and therefore in a sense the leaders of our branch were to blame, and no doubt this was replicated all over the country, or whether it was just a failure of the spirit of the rank and file. And I think it's a bit of both, but you know, we've had lots of battles since then. It would be wrong to say that the postal workers are the NUM of the 1990s and now, but you know, me and Rob are in ballots going on right now in the Bristol and District Amalgamated branch alone over job cuts, so you know, we're still there and fighting as best we can. But looking back to that meeting in 1984, I think what I do think now, and what I'm convinced of, Dave, is that you know what Dave Douglas says about the passion of history in the NUM was unique. It wasn't unique in the history of the British unions in having an education programme, but I think what the miners' education programme had, and I think the Communist Party does take some credit for this in part, was linking a passion for ideas with a passion for history that was family based. And I think the NUM was unique in that. And you know, in the post office we've got our own left-wing traditions of guild socialism, which was like a halfway house between kind of revolution and Ramsay and MacDonald. I mean, like, you know, it was something that I think the Green Party is interested in to this day, for example. But I never had a lesson in guild socialism. That tradition was never sustained. So I think one reason why the NUM actually achieved the strike for a year was the passion for education, which linked with the family passion, and why the postal workers actually meekly accepted the 1.75% extra, thank you very much, and helped the miners go to the feet, was that independent working class education was lacking in our unions. That's just a contribution to the memory of the discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, my name's Jeff Birch, ex-member of the Walthamstow Miners Support Group. I want to make 2 points. One is about the media and one is about community. There might be some response from the platform. On the media, it wasn't so much the way the strike was covered, although that was biased enough in terms of the BBC, but it was also the selection of items. For example, miners were killed during that dispute, miners were jailed during that dispute, and yet, as far as I can remember, very little was said by the orthodox media on those issues. Number 2, on the community, I actually disagree with the RMT. We do need political parties. The speaker from the RMT said forget about political parties. We do need political parties. The problem with the political parties is they let us down. Our own party, the party of the working class, supposedly, has been shitting on us for a decade or more. And we've got to do something. Somebody said down there somewhere that was a long time ago. The impact is still resonating in those old mining communities. There was something on Newsnight a few weeks ago when they went to Barnsley Labour Club, and there's a BNP poster on the railings of the Barnsley Labour Club, because the Labour Party have totally turned their back on the working class in those northern towns where the mines used to be. And that's the legacy. They still haven't recovered from those days in places like Barnsley. We were promised technology jobs, and even in those days, Scargill, I remember talking about wave power and wind power, and you know, he would actually be prepared to talk about going forward in that direction if they were able to provide jobs. And government said that they'd actually reinvest this money in those communities. That money didn't come forward. No. We're still waiting for it.
If I take that and then ask for a response from yourself, and then Olivia and then I'll come back there. Yeah, who wants to come back on first? The point on the media, and then also the point on the use of political parties, usefulness or not. Do you want to start on the media one?
Well, I mean,
I just wanted to come in quick. You know, we can't go on to the energy debate here, or be totally sidetracked from that. What the NUM has always said is that coal would buy us time to sustainable energy sources, and what we're talking in terms of solar energy. The NUM is against land-based wind turbine industry, because it's done more damage than 300 years of coal mining has to places of natural beauty and unspoiled wildernesses. So we're totally we're against the. We think it's a con. We think it's a classic case of greenwash. But in terms of, and it makes lots of money for Eon and other people like that. They don't have to turn a blade, and they still get their £200,000 a year or whatever. But no, we believe it'll buy us time. You know, I mean, there's only 35 years of uranium left in the world, and about something like 40, 50 years oil, and something like 400 years of coal. So, you know, I mean, even the way they mined it at my pit, my pit would be about 2,000 years of coal. My members were always supporters of Greenpeace, so we didn't dig much of it up. I mean, my pit's still there, so, you know, it's still working, my pit.
Yeah, I mean, on the jailing of the miners and those who appeared in court, I accept your point that there was very little coverage of that coming through in the national media. Of course, much of it took place in the latter half of the strike, and as I tried to explain, part of the problem was that the media agenda had changed. You know, the media had set the storyline, and the storyline was the return to work, the new faces. It was the new faces who were the heroes in the popular press, which were lined up against the miners. And as I acknowledged, you know, radio and television tended to become a cheerleader for the return to work, highlighting the brave people who had gone through the pickets. However much Glenn and Dave, you know, would want to choke on that, I'm just explaining that was the reality, and we have to look back and think, how was it that the Conservatives were so successful that they had not only had made plans on the industrial front, but they'd certainly got the media following an agenda which worked to the government's advantage. And I quite accept what your point is saying, that certain issues weren't picked up.
Can I just come back on this? Because I think, you know, in my naive way and in our naive way, we thought that the press was there to tell the truth, actually. We didn't think it needed any special encouragement. And, you know, we talk about the collapse of the strike. By the last week of the strike, 5% of the miners were back at work in Yorkshire. 5%. In Doncaster, 1% was back at work in the last week of the strike, and the press reported collapse of the miners' strike in Yorkshire.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to accept that it was an NUM conference that, you know,
it was by 4 votes.
Well, I know, but I mean, South Wales turned the tide. I mean, they said they were going to go back without an agreement. So, I mean,
my point is that the press didn't report Doncaster, strongest coalfield in Britain. No.
I've just accepted the decision of the media.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not coming in on this one. I'd like to tap down, but on the question of political parties, I don't think I actually did say there is no need for political parties. I hope I didn't. That would have been very dogmatic. I think there's plenty of evidence in the last 25 years that we ought to be taking stock of the kind of political parties and the kind of political representation that we've got, and I'm including the left, by the way. I'm not saying. I think there's pretty much awfulness wherever you look, and has been for a long time. I think we do need some new form of political representation for working class people. I think we ought to be just proceeding very, very carefully. And I think that any form of political representation ought to be strongly guided and led by the trade union movement. That's my belief. Further than that, I don't think in the present kind of climate we're able to go. But I certainly do accept that we need to have political conference.
Your own president of Bob Crow's association himself with the movement now, hasn't he, for the European elections?
Not a political party.
Okay, just we've got a couple more questions and we've only got a few minutes left. I just wanted to briefly plug that the next event we've got on the 15th is actually focusing on the energy belt specifically, and coal's fitting in that. And we've got a number of speakers on that, including somebody who's going to be talking about carbon capture technology and everything. So we're going to explore that.
Anybody from the NUM?
Tara and Sullivan.
Oh, great.
So yeah, so we're going to explore these topics more fully there. So hold on there. So I'll just do a quick shoot through. There was a gentleman there. You had a question, didn't you? A gentleman in the back, and I think the lady at the front. If that's all right, if we leave it there for 10 minutes, and there'll be time afterwards for book signings and everything like that. But if you make it brief points, then.
Buy the book because I want to carry them on back.
I think there's a few problems. One was the failure of imagination of the left to understand what they're doing, what they're dealing with mantras and ideology. Is that when Milton Friedman said that you could not have full employment, that inflation, because unions kept wages artificially high. The divide is ideological, and the media to this day will, and even supposed left-wing economists will repeat this mantra of the wage inflation problem, which is nonsense, without really thinking about it, because it's gone so through the ether. People it's imbued in people, and this economic crisis, as is to do with creating structural massive employment force down wages to the point where wages are so low. Low wages mean low tax receipts for any rate of growth. It means higher means tested benefit on tax credits. So it's the mining crisis and subsequent forcing down the wages for ideological economic reasons that has caused the economic crisis at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman at the back.
Yeah, I just want to very briefly say I salute the miners entirely. Fantastic job, yeah. Very good. Thanks for coming down and talking. Yeah. But I also want to also say how important it was the communities up and down the countries kind of backed up the struggle. Like at the start of it, I was living in Kent and I was aware of people in Norfolk taking food parcels up to various pits, and that really opened my eyes as a young man then, and that got me politicised. And then I did move up to Clay Cross in Derbyshire during the struggle, and I'd watch them come out of the pubs, yeah, and brick the fucking bastard scabs in their bastard coaches as they went through the village on their way to work, yeah, getting a nice life, a nice fucking existence, yeah. It didn't make any difference because the coaches were all meshed out, you know, they didn't break anything, but it was good frustrations out. Yeah, and I have to salute you because it's one thing fighting with the cops, as we've seen at the G20, yeah, having a day like of rage or whatever, but for the length of that time it took, you know, and going home to no food on the tables, no beer in the fucking cupboard in the fridge, you know, it was just terrible not being able to clothe your kids. And I seen that, and then afterwards, and that's what I want to pick up also. First off, the communities, how they support each other, and we set up our own welfare rights here to look after people who, because they got redundancy pay, and a man was sensible enough to pay off his mortgage and protect his family, the dole said, fuck off, you're not going to sign on, because you spent your money you could be living off. We turned that over, we sorted it out, we got him his redundancy pay he's entitled to. But it's a prolonged struggle, yeah, and I really think it is very important to flag up how communities can look after themselves without the state. I do think that's very important. Thank you.
And then the final one.
It kind of follows on what he's saying is about community collective action and working together. Glenn, you're saying that we need a representation to like represent the working classes, and then on the other hand, you're saying that the only way we can do it is doing it ourselves. And I'm really interested and part of collective organising, and the struggle continues for as long as I can do it. And I just wondered if you've got any pointers on sustaining collective action and anything that can help groups continue.
Do you two both want to come in?
Yeah, I want to come in because I haven't said anything about it because, you know, my colleague here has
covered very well about communities. But I want to say this. There were almost for 12 months 160,000 people on strike. 160,000 workers on strike. Of course, you had your families and your children along with that, added to that. At the best ever, we only ever had 20,000 pickets. 140,000 miners didn't picket for 12 months, and they stayed on strike. The only reason that they stayed out, they had it in a different word, because of the support groups, because we had an alternative structure, because we organised like the people in Free Derry did for a time, when they rejected the British Army's intervention, they rejected the bigots from the loyalist community and organised their own welfare, taxi service, all the rest of it. And the women in the community came to the forefront and did that. And for lots and lots and lots and lots of men who peeled potatoes, who made kids' dinners, who took over that kind of operation, that was as important as a battlefront as the glorious scenes of getting stuck in at Orgreave, exciting though that was. But if that 140,000 hadn't been sustained, the strike would have collapsed within days. Within days. And it's absolutely impossible to overestimate the importance of that solidarity movement to continue in that strike.
Yes, I mean, it's a really profound question, and we haven't got a lot of time, have we? I mean, to me, obviously the most successful forms of working class organisation are trade unions, so I think we have a lot to learn. But they also can be the most insular forms of organisation, so trade unions need to do a lot more, not only cross-union working to learn from each other, but also linking up with community organisations, and I think that's fairly straightforward, but we don't do it. I think trades councils are crucial. A lot of people haven't even heard of trades councils, but they're absolutely crucial, I think, to providing that link between what trade unions do and is helping workers to have power, because that's important, power and competence. I think a sort of, a nursery group, in a community trying to sort of get premises can learn a lot from successful other forms of working class organisation, as well as getting money from them. So we should be working together a lot more. I mean, I think a lot of unions have gone for many years along a very insular track. And a lot of my members, I'm sure it's not the only trade union where I hear from my members, why are we getting involved in this? Why aren't we just dealing with our own? Well, I mean, that's got to be fought, and people have got to realise that the links are essential to doing what the friend at the back says, which is to build a proper community. Trade unions are part of the community, and we should be building the kinds of links and money and strategies and buildings. Sorry to go off on a tangent, but I was in Liverpool recently and I went into, is it called St George's Hall? And I suddenly realised, I think it's that big one where it was built for the people, it's a people's meeting place now, and it really struck me how we haven't got anything. We've got a bloody post office in Bridgewater. I mean, I said this before, when they closed the post office in Bridgewater, we should have been in there. We should have had trade unions, all the community in there, occupying the building, just stopping them. And we're not, that's the kind of thing that we could do, when we don't do it. And I think that we could do it as communities, and I think trade unions could be helping a lot more to achieve that kind of. Sorry to ramble on, but it's, the options.
Well, I've just got a couple of points of housekeeping then. Firstly,
Did you just mention what the contribution of the Bristol trade union movement during the miners' strike? It's not been mentioned this evening. I don't know anybody here was involved in it, but there's a very active miners' support group here. Did an awful lot of good work, all the trade unions in this city did. I remember going over with a delegation to Pontypool Miners' Welfare at Christmas with a cheque for £100,000 from Bristol Trades Council for the organising the holidays for miners' children. Bristol trade union movement fought a good war during the miners' strike. I think that needs to be recognised during, in this meeting.
Thank you. Well, the final bits of housekeeping. I've been asked to point out that by the door there's a big pile of leaflets exposing the BMP, and if you do want to grab a handful and do your street to county BMP's flyers, feel free. And also this gentleman here just wanted to mention about, while we're on subject trade unions.
Yeah, while we're on the subject of trade unions and support groups, some of you may be aware that the refuse workers are taking strike action at the moment. They've not had a pay rise for several years, and they're asking for a pay rise. They've not been given one. We're holding a support group meeting because I think money's getting tight for a few people already at the Communication Workers Union this Friday, at midday. And if I can be a bit cheeky as well, I don't think there's been a collection announced for anything, so if I could make a collection for some money towards the refuse workers, I'm sure that would be much appreciated, and I'll take it.
Okay, well, with the gentleman's paper collection, and then the apologies for everybody who's not got a chance to speak. I know there's been several hands that we've not had a chance, and I do apologise, but we're out of time. The final thing I just want to say then, I mean, it's interesting, the first ever protest I went on was 1992, was a miners' protest. So it's been absolutely fascinating to hear the recollection. I do want to thank our three speakers and all the other people who've helped organise this meeting, so if you have a round of applause for us.